our 14th lecture. This one is all about photography. So we're not going to look at any painting or sculpture, architecture today, just photography. What you need to know is that in the second half of the 19th century, a few factors contributed to the way that art moves forward. First, there's this movement called positivism, which is kind of a continuation of the Enlightenment. And it's where scientists thought that everything has a set immutable laws that would lead to complete understanding of nature and human beings if only the laws can be discovered, so sort of through empiricism. And then in the arts, there was a decline in romanticism, or this irrationality or emotionality, in favor of realism. And we will talk about the art movement that's called realism, but today we're talking about photography. And the other thing is there was revolution. And this brought about the questioning of authority and the idea of what an ideal society should look like, and who should decide the government of the future. Is it for the masses or the wealthy few? Ironically, the bourgeoisie, who gained power not too long ago, are now seen as the tyrannical force. This can all be traced back to the Protestant Reformation, in which they questioned the authority of the Pope, and they said, read the Bible yourself. So there was an interest in literacy, and there was an interest in questioning of authority. That brings us to the invention of photography and why it became useful. Because now regular people can become more important. You can take pictures of the workers as opposed to the bourgeoisie. You can see the world more precisely using empirical methods. So this lecture will be broken up into two parts. The first part is going to be inventors, and we'll talk about the problem that they were trying to solve, which was they needed something that would focus and project images, and they also needed something to record those images. And the technologies to do these things had been known, but now people were putting these together, and there was a use for photography that hadn't existed before. Okay, so the first problem to overcome in photography was what's the best way to capture an image using chemical solutions? I mean, when we talked about Vermeer, basically he was capturing images. He was using that wax sheet thing that I explained. And then what could stop the light sensitivity so that the image would not continue to develop until it became completely exposed, and therefore it would just be like a bright white thing. So you had to have some sort of solution that would embed images onto something, and then you needed to be able to stop that exposure so that you could capture an image. Silver nitrate and silver chloride were known to be sensitive materials by the 17th century, and these could be the chemical solutions to capture the images. And then there were various salts that could bond with unexposed silver salts that would stop exposure, and then you could create a shutter to stop light from entering. So there were all these things that were out there. They just needed to be combined. Okay, we start with Guerre, who used the camera obscura as an aid to help him draw. And then in 1835, he discovered how to develop images from exposure using mercury vapors. This shortens the exposure time that's needed. And then he also figured out how to fix the images. And you will read about Niepce, who was a partner of Guerre, but he died kind of early and Guerre took over the work. So I'm basically saying Guerre was the one who gave us the first photo. He had a way of developing photographic plates. There was a process which greatly reduced exposure time from 8 hours down to a half an hour. And he also discovered that an image could be made permanent by immersing it in salt. And to bring this strangely back to the Reformation, just like anybody who had the ability to read could then read the Bible, Guerre claimed that this required no knowledge of drawing. Anyone may succeed and perform as well as the author of the invention. So, meaning anybody could be a photographer if they just had the materials and the wherewithal. So this is kind of the first photo. This was a photograph by Louis Daguerre. And the process, the daguerreotype process, is very good, but it was expensive, and each picture was unique. You didn't have the ability to make copies of the picture. This is from like his studio, and I'm going to show you like a close-up of this, but there's an interesting sort of, it looks all barren, as if nothing's happening, but that's because the exposure time was long. And so if there were carts or something rolling down the street, they wouldn't be able to be captured because they were moving too fast. But there was a thing that was happening that wasn't too fast that was captured on this, and I'll show you that. So you can see that down there on the sidewalk, there's a man getting his shoe shined, and the exposure would have taken at least 10 minutes, but it's possible that he let this happen for about 30 minutes. But before this, it would have been an 8-hour process. So Louis de Guerre, by speeding up the process, was able to actually capture this photo of a man getting his shoe shined. All right, next we have William Henry Fox Talbot. He was an Englishman who experimented with different processes during the 1830s, and he invented the calotype. And the calotype treated paper and was put into the back of the camera obscura, and it produced a negative image. So what happened was the negative was small, it was poor quality, especially if you compared it with the images that were created by daguerreotype. However, the advantage was that there was an unlimited number of positive prints that could be made. So you take the negative and then you can create positive prints from that. So while daguerreotypes were unique and you can only have one, William Henry Fox Talbot's calotypes allowed for many. Now it was all grainy and hard to see and didn't look that great, but at least you could have more than one photo. So now anyone who's dabbling in photography has this dilemma. Do they want the sharp, one-of-a-kind, unique images of daguerreotypes, or do they want fuzzy, multiple images, calotypes? Well, I imagine you can see where this is going. In 1851, there was a new era in photography that was introduced by Frederick Scott Archer, and he introduced the collodion process. And the process was much faster than conventional methods. It actually reduced exposure time to 2 or 3 seconds. It was called wet plate collodion negatives, and the negatives were on glass plates, and this allowed the printing of multiple and sharp images. So basically, by having the image sort of embedded on a plate, you could put something on top of it and pull off. It had to be prepared just before exposure, and the image had to be done while the plate was still wet. That's why it's called wet plate collodion negatives. So basically, you had to have like a person there, your assistant, who was preparing all the plates, and then he would put them right in the box, and then you capture the image in just a few seconds, as opposed to the very long time that it took for daguerreotypes. Okay, I imagine that you see where this is going then. The final sort of big step was Dr. Richard Maddox, who developed a dry gelatin-based coating so that you didn't have to get the plates wet right before. You could just use this gelatin that already existed, and they could be mass-produced, and this led to the invention of the handheld camera. This gelatin had only been discovered a few years before, and then he figured out how to incorporate the chemicals for photography into it. This is called the dry plate process, and dry plates could be developed more quickly than with any previous technique, and it was refined to the extent that factory-made photographic material was now becoming possible. So by incorporating this gelatin-based chemical process, you get Kodak cameras and the invention of mass-produced photography. Okay, so that was a very fast 8 minutes of the history of like the invention of photography. And I skipped over a whole bunch of stuff, and I am not an expert in photography. So if you know more than me, that's great. But those were like the big milestones in photography. But I can talk a little bit more authoritatively on the early pioneers of photography, because this is when the art part comes in. So now that it's possible to capture reality, what do people do with this technology? How do they create art with it? One of the first things that photographers did is they took pictures of war. This is known as the rebel sharpshooter. Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady both took pictures of the Civil War battlefields. And this might look to you as just a documented thing, like this is just a picture of a dead soldier, and he took this to show the horror of war, which is true. However, there is an art to this as well, and it's not just the composition, which is really interesting actually, where you have all these sort of lines converging, and you have that really bright spot on the top and the body on the bottom, but the image is not organic. And by that I mean the photographer dragged the dead body to the site, and then he posed it, making us question already, right at the beginning of this art form, the truthfulness and the validity of it. Can we really trust a photographer if they're taking pictures? I mean, we have this problem today with Photoshop and deep fakes. So even right at the beginning of photography, yes, this is a real dead body, and yes, that person did die in the battle. But in order to create a greater emotional effect, he dragged the body, laid the gun there, made it look like he was shooting from a fortified position. Julia Margaret Cameron got kind of arty with her portraits. So she did these out of focus portraits of great British men. And the question is, well, why is she making it kind of blurry, and she has this chiaroscuro effect, and she wanted it to maybe seem a little bit like a painting or have that quality of romanticism, that idea of connecting emotionally with the subject of the photograph. Nadar was also a pioneer of early photography. He was one of the first to go up into a hot air balloon and set up a whole camera rig and take pictures from above. He was also a minimalist, and he wanted only natural sunlight, and he wanted this blank background for his portraits of his famous contemporaries. Sarah Bernhardt was a famous actress in France. Charles Baudelaire is a famous poet. So he was trying to capture like the celebrities of his day, but he wanted them to have this minimalist look to them. Okay, before we talk about the next pioneer, which is Edward Muybridge, I want to talk about Unsupported Transit. So there's this painting by Guerre called Derby at Epsom, and it shows people horse racing. And because you couldn't like stop the motion of a horse, people didn't really know how horses move. And there was always this question of, was there ever a point where all their legs were in the air at once? So in 1872, the former governor of California, Leland Stanford, the same guy who the college is named after, he was a businessman, he was a racehorse owner, and he hired Edward Muybridge for some photographic studies. Stanford had taken the position on the popular debate, and he believed that unsupported transit was something that happened in the trot and the gallop. And he wanted to prove it scientifically, so he hired Muybridge to settle the question. And so in 1872, Muybridge began experimenting, and he set up an array of 12 cameras, and he photographed a galloping horse in a sequence of shots. And his initial efforts proved that Stanford was right. And he made a ton of these photo series and of different animals. And I imagine that you looking at this can tell that this is the beginning of movies. There was this machine that they built where you could sort of spin it and then you could watch the horse run. So this is the sort of the first form of the moving pictures. I don't usually get into biography that much because it does inform the images often. And we'll talk about biography a lot when we get to Picasso and Gauguin. But an interesting side note, and it's kind of a sad and weird one about Muybridge, is that in 1874, he murdered his wife's lover and he was acquitted on justifiable homicide. So you don't really think of, like, when you're looking at these images of running horses or people moving in his animal locomotion series about how he was a murderer and acquitted for murder. But there it is, Edward Muybridge, amazing photographer, also killed his wife's lover. So we've talked about the different pioneers, the early pioneers of photography, how you could move things to manipulate the viewer. But there were other uses for photography. I mean, everybody could now have their portrait available. Like you couldn't sit for a painting before, but now you can sit for a couple minutes to get your photograph taken. You can document all of the horrible working conditions in all of those new factories during the Industrial Revolution. Take pictures of wars and people can see like the actual death tolls. You can travel, you can walk around with that camera and you can take pictures of things. We'll talk about Orientalism later, but it plays a part in this. Science. You had the ability to observe something, like take a picture of a flower that you couldn't before. From the very beginning of photography, there's been this tension because it's both like you can have this exact replica of the world, be objective and verifiable, but also it's malleable and you can play some tricks with photography. And so photography has this tension. Still today, photography can be manipulated, as we know, but it is a very important tool. And I will leave you with the question of, what do you think photography is going to do to painting? Because if you don't need to be exact anymore, how is this going to affect what people decide to paint?